Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to be giving you some setup information for understanding Lloyd Bitzer's article, The Rhetorical Situation. And you may notice that this presentation seems to have a lot in common with the presentation I gave for understanding Brandt. And in fact, I want to start by reiterating some of the advice that I gave you then. For example, annotate what you're writing. I did this again with my Lloyd Bitzer article. I highlight a lot of things that catch my eye. You might also circle things, write comments and questions in the margins, and of course save all of that so that you have a record of what your thought process was as you were reading through the document. All of that helps you to more deeply engage with the writing in the article and also to remember what you've read as well. I also encourage you to paraphrase and summarize. That's a really good tool for helping you to take a complex utterance and to translate it into something that you will understand and remember. And with just like we did with Brandt, I'm going to emphasize for Bitzer that all scholarly writing is entering a conversation. So the first question we want to ask about this Bitzer piece is, what discipline or field is he in? Who is the audience that he's trying to talk to here? Like last time, I said one good place to look is the journal that Bitzer is publishing in. So if we look at the first page of this PDF, we'll see that he's publishing in a journal called Philosophy and Rhetoric. And I can tell you that this is yet another journal that's part of the writing studies field, just like Deborah Brandt's field. So we're still talking to an audience of specialists, of PhDs, of scholars in the field of writing studies. And the second most important question we want to ask when we're considering, what is this scholarly conversation is which particular scholarly conversation is Bitzer entering? And you have to look for those signs in which an author is kind of essentially clearing the way to say, no one has talked about this before. No one has talked about X before. And here's how I'm going to introduce a new idea. We saw that in the Brandt, and we can also see this in the Bitzer article. So we know that, of course, the title of the piece is The Rhetorical Situation. And we get some signs on page 1 and 2 about how Bitzer is framing a new conversation or entering an existing scholarly conversation. So on page 1, he remarks, perhaps this question, he's asked a question about rhetorical discourse, perhaps this question is puzzling because situation is not a standard term in the vocabulary of rhetorical theory. Okay, so we're already getting a hint here. Bitzer is telling us, hey everybody, I'm introducing this new term I've invented about the rhetorical situation. That's a new term that no one had really used before Bitzer. He's the one introducing it here. On page 2, he goes into even greater depth in terms of what he is contributing to this conversation. And I'll just read a part of this passage on the right. No major theorist has treated rhetorical situation thoroughly as a distinct subject in rhetorical theory. Many ignore it. Okay, in that sentence alone, we're already getting a sense that Bitzer's contribution is to develop this concept of the rhetorical situation. I'll keep reading. Those rhetoricians who discuss situation do so indirectly, as does Aristotle, for example, who is led to consider situation when he treats types of discourse. More emphasis here. None, to my knowledge, has asked the nature of rhetorical situation. Again, another sign that this is what Bitzer is going to be answering, or a gap that he's going to be filling in. Instead, rhetoricians have asked, what is the process by which the orator creates and presents discourse? What is the nature of rhetorical discourse? What sorts of interactions occur between speaker, audience, subject, and occasion? He's saying these are all familiar questions. Everybody answers these questions. These are not new. Typically, I'm reading again, the questions which trigger theories of rhetoric focus upon the orator's method or upon the discourse itself, rather than upon the situation which invites the orator's application of his method and the creation of discourse. So again, he's emphasizing that people rarely talk about the situations that provoke rhetorical response. Everyone's focused on the rhetorical response itself, but not the preceding situation that provokes the rhetoric. So this is really what Bitzer is homing in on in this article. Now, a number of you have mentioned to me and in your posts that you have done rhetorical analyses in your high school classes. So I imagine that rhetoric, the word rhetoric, is one that's familiar to some of you. For those of you who are less familiar with this word rhetoric, it simply refers to any attempt to persuade or make a change in the world. The latter thing I said is Bitzer's way of putting it. Rhetoric aims to persuade other people. And that's what rhetoric refers to. So Bitzer is drawing attention to the thing that precedes our decision to persuade, the situation that provokes us to want to persuade. And the rhetorical situation, according to Bitzer, is made up of these three parts: exigence, audience, and constraints. One of those terms might seem familiar to you, audience. Let's start with exigence. Bitzer says that exigence is an imperfection marked by urgency, a defect, an obstacle, something waiting to be done. We could rephrase this in very simple words as like a problem. There is a problem that needs fixing. That's one key part of a rhetorical situation. A problem exists. That's what he means by exigence. Number two, audience. There needs to be persons who are capable of being influenced by discourse and of being mediators of change. There also needs to be someone who can do something about the problem. That also needs to exist for a rhetorical situation to exist. So let me give you a quick example. Like if a hurricane is bearing down on South Carolina, that's a problem. You could call that an exigence. If your goal is to stop the hurricane from hitting us, to kind of just evaporate it, there are no people who exist who are able to make that change. Unfortunately, we just don't have people who can do that. So that's not a rhetorical situation because there is no audience to persuade, to make them go dissolve the hurricane. I mean, unless our audience is God, but that's a tangent and not something we're going to talk about here. So we need an audience. Thirdly, we have constraints in a rhetorical situation. This is a little tricky. So Bitzer talks about constraints as being persons, events, objects, and relations, which are part of the situation because they have the power to constrain decision and action needed to modify the exigence. Okay, so let's try to translate what Bitzer means here by constraints. We know that by exigence, we have a problem that needs fixing, and we have an audience we need who can do something about it. By constraints, you could really say we're talking about any specific details of this situation that will narrow how we address it. So, for example, your audience might have specific beliefs or principles that you need to cater to. Like, you really want to play up their principles and beliefs in your response in order to persuade them. That's a constraint. Or let's say that the only way that you can reach your audience is through text message. That's also a constraint because you have to tailor your message within the constraints of a text message. Really, any mode of delivery is a constraint. So talking verbally is a constraint. Composing an email is a constraint. Writing a text message or writing a tweet is also a constraint. Anything that constrains how you speak or communicate by a specific genre or form is a constraint. So these are the three elements of a rhetorical situation that need to exist before a rhetorical response can even occur. So here are some examples of rhetorical situations that Bitzer himself discusses. He talks, for example, about a bunch of fishermen at the beginning of his article, and he says that the fact that there are fish that need to be caught is a rhetorical situation because the fishermen need to communicate with one another in order to effectively catch the fish. So that's an example of a rhetorical situation. Another rhetorical situation he mentions is the continuing problem of air pollution. That is a problem for which there exists an audience who can do something about it, such as political bodies and governments, etc. And there are constraints about how you would go about communicating with that audience that narrow how you would respond. He also gives the example of the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, we should note that there's no way that any audience could undo the assassination of President Kennedy. So that's not the rhetorical situation, the fact that President Kennedy was assassinated. Instead, the rhetorical situation again, is something we can do something about. So I think he's referring to the conditions of grief, shock, and fear that exist in society in the wake of that assassination. That's a problem that rhetoric can do something about. There's an audience to talk to, there are constraints that govern how it will communicate with that audience, and there's a problem that can be changed. Bitzer also notes that there are situations that he finds to be not rhetorical. One example is poetry. He says, you don't normally write poetry to persuade someone or to fix a problem. You're kind of expressing your own creativity in a kind of closed off way. He said that's not a rhetorical situation. He also says that some scientific studies aren't rhetorical situation. I'm not a scientist, but let's say if you're studying the way the crystals of salt work, he's saying you're not doing that to change anyone's mind. You're not doing that to persuade them of anything. So that's not a rhetorical situation. I think we could honestly take a bit of issue with Bitzer's claims here because I'm certain that some poetry and some scientific studies are very much intended to change the minds of the general public or, governments, etc. But, I'm just summarizing Bitzer here. And then finally, he says, it's not a rhetorical situation if language can't participate in making a difference. So let me give you an example. Let's say in my backyard, there is a tree and it's dead, and so it needs to come down. So I'm going to go out there and take an axe or a chainsaw and cut the tree down. Okay, language is not involved in that change at all, so it's not a rhetorical situation. But let's say this dead tree, it somehow exists on like shared land where like you have to talk with your neighbors or other people on the block to convince them all to agree to cut down the tree. That's a rhetorical situation because you need language and you need persuasion to get that tree to come down. So that's one way of deciphering whether or not a situation is rhetorical or not. Oh, I'm going to move my head down a little bit so you can see what I wrote. Finally, he also notes quite interestingly that rhetorical situations are separate from the rhetorical response, and they aren't always necessarily connected to a rhetorical response because we have to decide to respond to a situation. It's up to us. So, as he says, rhetorical situations rise and fall or mature and decay all the time. Sometimes we respond to them, sometimes we don't. So that's one way that rhetorical situations are separate from rhetorical response. Like you could imagine yourself sitting down to Thanksgiving dinner with your family, and your very obnoxious uncle sits down and says something very offensive to you, and you feel like this is a moment where persuasion could be necessary because there's an audience to persuade, there's a problem that needs to be fixed because your uncle has just been very offensive, and there are constraints about how you can do that. Now, your rhetorical response only exists if you decide to respond to that uncle. If you bite your tongue and keep going, that's a rhetorical situation that matures and decays. It shows up and then it goes away, and it's up to you whether or not you respond to that. All right, so this is my quick primer for some of the ideas that Bitzer addresses in his article.